As he studies the strange vegetation glowing in his backyard, he realizes its ability to grow without sunlight could revolutionize indoor farming forever. What he discovers next leaves agricultural scientists speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On a crisp autumn morning, something caught his eye that made him question everything he knew about botany. There, nestled between his tomato plants, was a small cluster of vegetation that seemed to pulse with an ethereal blue-green light. Michael Anderson had been tending to his crops since sunrise, just as he did every morning, but this sight stopped him dead in his tracks. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him in the early morning light. The sun had barely crested over the distant mountains, casting long shadows across his 20 acres of farmland. He blinked several times, even rubbed his eyes, but the gentle glow remained. The plant looked unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Its leaves were translucent with visible veins that carried what appeared to be luminescent sap, and its stem had an almost crystalline quality. Michael stood frozen, staring at the peculiar growth for what felt like hours, his mind racing with questions about its origin and what its discovery might mean. The timing was particularly strange, as just last week, local news had reported a meteor shower in the area, with several fragments believed to have landed in the surrounding countryside. Michael couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between these events and this extraordinary discovery in his backyard. He'd watched the meteor shower himself from his front porch, marveling at the streaks of light painting the Montana sky. Some locals had even reported finding small, strange-looking rocks scattered across their properties, sparking numerous discussions at the town's only diner about potential extraterrestrial visitors. As he crouched down to examine the plant more closely, he noticed that the soil around it had an unusual quality. It seemed to shimmer slightly, as if infused with microscopic particles of glass. The plant itself was about knee-high, with 5 main stems branching out from a central stalk. Each stem supported a cluster of leaves that seemed to respond to his presence, subtly shifting their position as he moved around them, like a sunflower tracking the sun's movement, but with an unsettling awareness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The glow wasn't constant either. It seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The pattern was hypnotic. 3 quick pulses followed by a longer one, then a pause before the sequence repeated. Michael reached out tentatively to touch one of the leaves, then quickly pulled his hand back. The rational part of his brain warned him against touching unknown vegetation, especially one that exhibited such unusual properties. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began documenting everything he saw. He took dozens of photos and several videos, trying to capture the plant's otherworldly qualities from every angle. The morning sun was rising higher in the sky now, but it didn't diminish the plant's ethereal glow. If anything, the contrast between natural sunlight and the plant's internal luminescence made it even more striking. The light seemed to dance and shift, creating patterns that reminded him of the aurora borealis he'd seen during a trip to Alaska years ago. As he filmed, Michael noticed something he hadn't seen at first. The plant's roots weren't typical either. They appeared to be partially exposed above the soil, and they too carried the same luminescent quality. They spread out in a complex network that reminded him of fiber optic cables, branching and interconnecting in ways that seemed almost deliberately planned rather than naturally occurring. Some of these root tendrils extended several feet from the main plant, creating a web-like pattern in the soil. Michael's mind was already racing with possibilities. As a farmer who had struggled with the challenges of traditional agriculture, unpredictable weather patterns, limited growing seasons, and the constant battle against pests and diseases, he couldn't help but wonder about the potential applications of a plant that could generate its own light. Could it be grown indoors without artificial lighting? Would it require less water or nutrients than conventional crops? The implications could be revolutionary, especially for regions with limited access to sunlight or areas where traditional farming wasn't viable. But there was also a sense of unease. In his 20 years of farming, Michael had never encountered anything like this. He'd studied agricultural science in college and kept up with the latest developments in farming technology. But this defied all conventional explanation. The rational part of his brain suggested he should report this to authorities, or at least consult with agricultural experts. Yet something held him back, a mixture of curiosity and protectiveness over his discovery. He'd heard stories of government agencies swooping in and cordoning off areas where unusual phenomena were reported, and the thought of losing access to this potentially groundbreaking discovery made him hesitate. As he continued to observe the plant, he noticed something even more extraordinary. The surrounding soil, which had initially appeared merely shimmery, was now showing signs of increased fertility. The nearby tomato plants seemed more vigorous than they had been yesterday, their leaves a deeper shade of green and their stems more robust. It was as if the mysterious plant was somehow enriching the soil around it, transforming the very earth it grew in. Michael spent the next hour carefully examining the area around the plant, taking soil samples and noting any unusual characteristics. He marked the location with several stakes and took measurements of the plant's height and spread. If it was growing, and he suspected it was, he wanted to track its progress with scientific precision. He even set up his old trail camera nearby, hoping to capture any changes or unusual activity when he wasn't present. Before heading back to his house, Michael made one final observation that sent a chill down his spine. Near the base of the plant, partially buried in the soil, was a small fragment of what appeared to be meteorite material. The rock had the same ethereal quality as the plant, with tiny veins of luminescent material running through its surface. When he carefully brushed away some of the soil around it, he noticed that the rock seemed to be gradually dissolving, its material being absorbed into the surrounding earth. As he walked back to his house, Michael's mind was overwhelmed with questions. Should he tell anyone about his discovery? Would people even believe him? And more importantly, what should he do with this potentially groundbreaking find? The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew that whatever decision he made in the next few hours could have far-reaching consequences not just for him, but potentially for the future of agriculture itself. Little did he know, this mysterious glowing plant would soon change not only his life, but potentially the future of agriculture itself. Michael Anderson's farm, Valley View Acres, had been in his family since his grandfather first broke ground in the 1940s. Nestled in the rolling hills of western Montana, the 20-acre property had once been the pride of Jefferson County, known for its premium organic produce and innovative farming techniques. But recent years had brought challenges that threatened to end 3 generations of agricultural heritage. As Michael sat at his weathered kitchen table that morning, staring into his coffee cup while contemplating the glowing plant he'd discovered, his mind wandered to the mounting bills stacked beside him. The past 5 years had been particularly brutal. Climate change had wreaked havoc on traditional growing seasons, with unprecedented droughts followed by flooding that had destroyed nearly half his crops 2 years in a row. Insurance barely covered the losses, and the bank was becoming increasingly impatient about his loan payments. The transition to organic farming, which his father had initiated 15 years ago, had initially seemed like a smart move. Consumers were willing to pay premium prices for chemical-free produce, and the soil health had improved significantly. But now, with several large corporations moving into the area and flooding the market with cheaper, organic alternatives, small farmers like Michael were struggling to compete. His farmers market regulars, many of whom had been loyal customers for years, were increasingly drawn to the lower prices at the new megastores. Rising from his chair, Michael walked to the window overlooking his fields. The morning sun illuminated rows of vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, and leafy greens that would have made his father proud. But pride didn't pay the bills, and the reality was that he needed something more than traditional farming to keep the property afloat. He'd already been forced to sell off 5 acres last year to cover equipment repairs and his mother's medical bills after her stroke. His eyes drifted to the corner of the property where he'd discovered the glowing plant. From this distance, it looked like any other vegetation, its otherworldly properties hidden from view. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery might be more than just a scientific curiosity. It could be the breakthrough he'd been praying for. Sarah, his wife of 12 years, would be returning from her night shift at the local hospital soon. She'd taken the nursing job 3 years ago, when the farm's income alone couldn't sustain them anymore. The arrangement had been meant to be temporary, but temporary had stretched into years, and the strain was showing on both of them. Their teenage daughter, Emma, had already started talking about skipping college to help save money, a thought that kept Michael awake at night. The sound of tires on gravel pulled Michael from his thoughts. Through the window, he watched as Dave Miller's truck pulled up to the house. Dave, his closest neighbor and friend since childhood, had his own struggling farm 5 miles down the road. They'd helped each other through countless challenges over the years, sharing equipment, labor, and moral support. But lately, their conversations had turned increasingly to the possibility of selling their lands to developers who were eager to turn the fertile valley into another suburban sprawl. "Morning, Mike," Dave called out as he approached the house. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you needed help with that irrigation issue you mentioned yesterday." He paused at the bottom of the porch steps, studying Michael's expression. "Everything okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Michael hesitated. Dave was the one person he might be able to trust with his discovery, but something held him back. The glowing plant represented hope, perhaps the last hope for saving his farm, and he wasn't ready to share that hope just yet, not even with his oldest friend. "Just tired," Michael replied, forcing a smile. "Been up since 4 trying to figure out these new organic certification requirements. They're making it harder every year." Dave nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about it. Just got a letter saying they're raising the inspection fees again. It's like they're trying to push us small farmers out of business." As they walked toward the equipment shed, Michael's mind kept returning to the glowing plant. If it really did have the properties he suspected, the ability to grow without sunlight, to enrich the soil around it, it could revolutionize indoor farming. He could convert his old barn into a growing facility, produce crops year-round regardless of weather conditions. The possibilities were endless. But there were risks, too. What if the plant was dangerous? What if it spread beyond his control? The rational part of his brain warned him about the potential consequences of experimenting with an unknown species, especially one that might have extraterrestrial origins. Yet, the desperate part of him, the part that lay awake at night wondering how to save his family's legacy, saw only opportunity. The sound of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway interrupted his thoughts. She looked exhausted as she stepped out, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a long night shift. Michael felt a familiar pang of guilt. This wasn't the life they'd planned when they got married. She'd dreamed of running a small flower shop on the property, teaching gardening classes to local kids. Instead, she was working 12-hour shifts to keep their dreams from completely falling apart. "I'll catch you later, Mike," Dave said, sensing the private moment. "Let me know if you need help with that irrigation system." As Sarah approached, Michael made a decision. He couldn't tell Dave about his discovery yet, but Sarah deserved to know. They'd always faced their challenges together, and this would be no different. Besides, with her background in biology, she'd studied it in college before switching to nursing, she might have insights he hadn't considered. "Rough night?" he asked, pulling her into a hug. "The usual," she replied, stifling a yawn. "But Mrs. Henderson's finally showing improvement, so that's something." She pulled back, studying his face. "What's wrong? You've got that look." "I need to show you something," Michael said quietly. "But you have to promise to keep it between us for now. I found something this morning that could change everything." As they walked toward the tomato field, Michael explained about the meteor shower and his morning discovery. Sarah listened without interrupting, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten. When they reached the glowing plant, she gasped, all traces of fatigue vanishing from her face. "Michael," she whispered, crouching down to examine the luminescent leaves. "This is incredible. Have you told anyone else about this?" "Not yet," he replied. "I wanted you to see it first. What do you think? Am I crazy to think this could be our chance to turn things around?" Sarah stood slowly, her scientific mind clearly processing the implications. No, you're not crazy. But we need to be careful. Very careful. This could be exactly what we need. Or it could be something we don't fully understand. Looking at his wife's face, seeing the same mix of hope and caution he felt, Michael knew they were at a crucial turning point. Whatever they decided to do next would determine not just their future, but possibly the future of farming itself. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on them both as they stood there, watching the strange plant pulse with its ethereal light in the morning sun. After spending several hours observing the glowing plant with Sarah, Michael retreated to his study, a small room off the kitchen filled with agricultural journals, soil samples, and his grandfather's old farming logs. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows as he pored over research papers about bioluminescent organisms, searching for anything remotely similar to what was growing in his field. Sarah sat across from him, her nursing scrubs exchanged for comfortable clothes, dark circles under her eyes, testament to her long night shift. Yet exhaustion couldn't dampen her excitement as she scrolled through scientific databases on her laptop. Her biology background was proving invaluable as they tried to understand their mysterious discovery. "Look at this," she said, turning her screen toward Michael. "There are naturally bioluminescent plants, but none of them produce sustained light like this one, and certainly none that affect the surrounding soil the way you described." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We need to decide what to do with this, Michael. Soon." Their options lay before them like paths diverging in a forest, each with its own risks and potential rewards. They could report the discovery to agricultural authorities or university researchers, the responsible choice that would ensure proper scientific study. But that path likely meant losing control of their discovery, watching from the sidelines as others reaped the benefits of what had literally landed in their backyard. The alternative was to keep it secret, at least temporarily. They could study the plant themselves, document its properties, perhaps even find a way to propagate it. If successful, they could patent any unique agricultural applications before going public. The potential financial rewards could save not just their farm, but revolutionize indoor farming globally. "What about testing?" Michael asked, running his hands through his graying hair. "We need to know if it's safe, if it's affecting the surrounding plants. Who knows what it might do to the soil long term? Or to us?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I might have a solution for that. Remember Jenny from the hospital? Her husband works at the university's agricultural research lab. She's mentioned that he does freelance testing sometimes. We could ask him to run some analyses off the books, soil composition, plant tissue samples, that sort of thing." The mention of testing brought another concern to Michael's mind. Rising from his chair, he walked to the window overlooking their property. The glowing plant wasn't visible from here, but he knew exactly where it was. What if it spreads? We've got the Hendersons' organic farm on one side and Dave's place on the other. If this thing turns out to be invasive, then we need to contain it, Sarah finished his thought. We could build a greenhouse around it. That old glass structure behind the barn. We could move it piece by piece. It would look natural enough. Everyone knows we've been talking about expanding our greenhouse operation. The sound of their daughter Emma's school bus pulling up interrupted their discussion. Through the window, they watched their 16-year-old daughter hop down the steps, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She'd inherited Sarah's scientific curiosity and Michael's love for the land. Just last week, she'd been talking about studying agricultural science in college, if they could afford it. "What about Emma?" Michael asked softly. "Do we tell her?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "She's old enough to understand the implications, and keeping it from her would be difficult anyway. She spends half her free time in the gardens." The decision seemed to crystallize in Michael's mind. They would keep the discovery private for now, but not completely secret. A small circle of trust, family, and perhaps one or two essential allies who could help them understand what they were dealing with. They would proceed carefully, scientifically, documenting everything. "We need to establish a timeline," Sarah said, pulling out a notepad. "First priority is containment and basic safety testing, Then propagation experiments, if it proves safe. We document everything, build our case carefully. If this plant can really grow without sunlight and enrich soil the way you described, it could change everything. Not just for us, but for farming in general. Michael nodded slowly. We'll need supplies, special growing medium, sensors to monitor light levels and soil conditions, and we'll have to be careful about how we get them. Too many unusual purchases at once might raise questions. I can handle some of that through my hospital contacts, Sarah offered. Medical equipment suppliers often carry environmental monitoring gear too. It won't seem strange coming from me. As they laid out their plans, Michael felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were choosing a path that carried significant risks, professional, legal, and possibly even physical if the plant proved dangerous. But the potential rewards were too great to ignore. This could be the breakthrough that saved their farm, secured Emma's future, and maybe even helped address the growing challenges of global food production. One more thing, Sarah said, her expression serious. We need a fallback plan. If anything goes wrong, if the plant shows signs of being dangerous or if we can't control it, we need to be prepared to go public immediately. No hesitation, no matter what it might cost us. Michael agreed. They would proceed, but with clear boundaries and fail-safes in place. The weight of the decision settled over them both as they heard Emma's footsteps approaching the study. It was time to bring their daughter into the circle of trust, to share both the discovery and the responsibility it brought. As Emma entered the room, her face bright with stories from her day at school, Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. Their choice was made. For better or worse, they were embarking on a journey that would either secure their family's future or become their greatest regret. The glowing plant in their field represented hope, but like all powerful discoveries, it also carried the seeds of potential disaster. Emma, honey, Sarah began. Sit down. Your father and I need to show you something extraordinary. But first, you need to understand that what we're about to share comes with great responsibility. The following week was a blur of careful preparation and clandestine activity. Michael and Sarah had converted their old greenhouse into a makeshift research station, meticulously transporting it piece by piece to surround the glowing plant. To any casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than the greenhouse expansion they'd been discussing for months. Emma, proving herself more capable than either parent had anticipated, had taken charge of documenting everything with her digital camera and maintaining detailed logs of their observations. The light patterns have changed, Emma announced one morning, reviewing her time-lapse footage. She had set up her laptop on a weathered workbench inside the greenhouse, surrounded by monitoring equipment they'd gradually acquired. Look at this, the pulses are getting stronger at night, almost like it's compensating for the absence of sunlight. Michael leaned over her shoulder, studying the footage. The plant had indeed grown more luminescent during darkness hours, its blue-green glow casting ethereal shadows throughout the greenhouse. More intriguingly, it had nearly doubled in size over the past 7 days, far exceeding the growth rate of any natural plant he'd encountered in his decades of farming. Sarah entered the greenhouse carrying a collection of soil samples she'd had tested through her hospital contact's husband, Dr. James Chen. The results are fascinating, she said, spreading the papers across the workbench. The soil surrounding the plant shows significantly elevated levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's not being depleted. Somehow, the plant is generating these nutrients, not just consuming them. That's impossible, Michael muttered, though he'd seen enough impossible things lately to question his own skepticism. Plants don't create nutrients, they absorb them. This one does, Sarah replied, pointing to the chemical analysis. And there's more. The soil samples show traces of elements that don't match anything in the standard geological database. James is intrigued. He's asking questions. The mention of outside interests sent a ripple of tension through the greenhouse. They had agreed to maintain absolute secrecy until they understood more about their discovery, but they also needed expert insight. Dr. Chen's involvement was a calculated risk, one that grew more dangerous with each unusual test result. Emma had been experimenting with propagation. carefully taking cuttings from the smallest branches and attempting to root them in various growing mediums. Most had failed, turning black and dissolving into an odd, crystalline substance. But one cutting had survived, developing its own luminescent properties after 3 days in a special nutrient solution she'd developed. "Dad, look," she said, leading him to her propagation station. In a small, sealed container, a tiny replica of the parent plant pulsed with the same mysterious light. "I think I figured out the key. It needs a specific mineral balance, similar to what we found in the meteorite fragments." Michael examined the successful cutting with a mixture of pride and concern. His daughter's achievement was remarkable, but it also meant their discovery was now reproducible. The implications of that success added another layer of complexity to their situation. The plant's effect on nearby vegetation had become impossible to ignore. The tomato plants surrounding the greenhouse were producing fruit at twice their normal rate, their leaves a deep, almost unnatural shade of green. Even more surprisingly, they were showing signs of bioluminescence themselves, a faint glow visible only in complete darkness. "We need to establish a quarantine zone," Sarah insisted, marking a wide circle on their property map. "If this spreads to Dave's fields or the Hendersons' organic crops—" She didn't need to finish the thought. They had already discussed the potential catastrophe of an uncontrolled spread. Michael had been carefully monitoring the soil composition at increasing distances from the greenhouse, watching for any signs of contamination beyond their established safety perimeter. Their evenings had fallen into a new routine. After dinner, the family would gather in Michael's study, comparing notes and updating their documentation. Emma had created a detailed database of their observations, complete with growth rates, light intensity measurements, and chemical analyses. Sarah contributed her medical knowledge, monitoring for any potential health effects from prolonged exposure to the plant's unusual properties. "I think we're ready for the next phase," Michael said one evening, spreading out the blueprints for an underground growing chamber he'd designed. "We need to see if this plant can truly thrive without any natural light. If it can, it could revolutionize indoor farming," Emma finished, her eyes bright with excitement. "We could grow food anywhere, urban centers, desert regions, even underground bunkers." Sarah looked up from her notes, her expression cautious. "We need more safety data first. James mentioned something concerning in the latest soil analysis. The unknown elements are showing signs of self-replication. It's subtle, but the concentrations are increasing even in sealed samples." The implications of that revelation hung heavy in the air. A self-replicating element could be either a miracle or a disaster, depending on its properties and their ability to control it. Michael walked to the window, staring out at the greenhouse glowing faintly in the twilight. "Maybe we should bring Dr. Chen in fully," he suggested quietly. "His expertise could be crucial, and we're reaching the limits of what we can learn on our own." Emma shook her head vigorously. "Not yet, Dad. Once we tell him everything, we lose control. We need to understand more first, especially about the propagation process. I'm close to a breakthrough with the cuttings." The debate was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Through the window, Michael recognized Dave's truck in the driveway. His friend's unexpected visit sent a jolt of panic through the room. They had left some of their research materials spread across the kitchen table. "Emma, clear the kitchen," Sarah whispered urgently. "Michael, stall him." As Michael headed for the door, he caught a glimpse of the greenhouse in the gathering darkness. The plant's glow seemed to pulse more intensely than usual, as if responding to their anxiety. He took a deep breath, preparing to greet his friend while protecting their growing collection of secrets. The initial euphoria of their discovery began to fade as the first serious complications emerged. 3 weeks into their secret research project, Michael stood in the greenhouse at midnight, his flashlight beam playing over the strange transformation taking place before him. The glowing plant, now nearly 6 feet tall, had developed unexpected characteristics that filled him with growing unease. "It's not just growing anymore," he spoke into the digital recorder Emma had insisted they use to document everything. "It's changing." The plant's original 5 stems had twisted together into a central trunk, its surface now covered in what appeared to be crystalline nodes that pulsed with a deeper, more intense blue light. The surrounding soil had begun to develop a reflective quality, as if tiny mirrors were mixed into the earth. Sarah entered the greenhouse, her face illuminated by the plant's glow. She just finished her hospital shift and had driven straight to the research site instead of going to bed. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of mounting exhaustion, but her scientific curiosity remained undiminished. "The latest blood work came back from my contact at the lab," she said, her voice tight with concern. "The soil samples aren't the only things showing unusual properties. Our own blood samples are displaying elevated levels of unknown compounds. Nothing dangerous yet, but we have no idea what long-term exposure might do," Michael finished. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become more frequent as their concerns multiplied. "Have you noticed any symptoms, headaches, dizziness?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing definitive. Emma mentioned feeling more energetic, but that could be excitement about the research. I'm more worried about the changes in the local wildlife." They'd both noticed it. The insects and birds that normally frequented their farm had begun avoiding the greenhouse and its immediate vicinity. More troubling were the nocturnal visitors, rabbits and deer that seemed drawn to the plant's glow, standing motionless around the greenhouse for hours, their eyes reflecting the ethereal light. "Dad, Mom, you need to see this." Emma's urgent voice crackled through their walkie-talkies. She was supposed to be sleeping but had instead been monitoring her propagation experiments in the converted barn. They found her in her makeshift lab, staring at the successful cutting she'd grown weeks earlier. The small plant, previously a perfect miniature of its parent, had begun developing its own unique mutations. Its leaves had grown translucent, like thin sheets of living glass, and its stem had developed spiral patterns that emitted a pulsing red light instead of the original blue-green. "It's not following the same genetic pattern anymore," Emma explained, her voice mixing excitement with apprehension. "It's like it's evolving, but at an accelerated rate. And look at this." She pointed to her laptop screen, which displayed microscope images of the plant's cellular structure. "The cells aren't just dividing, they're reorganizing themselves. I've never seen anything like it." Michael shared a worried look with Sarah. Their daughter's brilliant mind had been essential to understanding the plant's properties, but her growing obsession with the research was concerning. She'd skipped school twice last week to monitor her experiments, and her recent college application essays had all focused on theoretical xenobotany, a red flag if they ever decided to go public with their discovery. Back in the main greenhouse, more troubling signs awaited them. The tomato plants nearest to the glowing specimen had begun exhibiting bizarre characteristics. Their fruits now contained small, luminescent seeds, and their vines grew in geometrically perfect patterns that defied natural plant growth habits. "We need to make a decision," Sarah said, reviewing their latest data. "The contamination is spreading faster than we anticipated. If it reaches the groundwater—" She left the sentence unfinished, but they all understood the implications. Their property sat atop an aquifer that supplied water to 3 neighboring counties. Dr. Chen had been asking more pointed questions about their soil samples, too. His last email hinted at bringing in colleagues from the university's environmental science department, warning about potential ecological hazards that required further investigation. "Maybe we should shut it down," Michael suggested quietly, voicing the thought that had been nagging at him for days. "Destroy the plant and all the samples before things get out of hand. We could till under the affected soil, treat it with herbicides." "No," Emma protested. "We're too close to understanding it. The applications for agriculture are incredible. Look at how it's enriching the soil, accelerating growth in other plants. If we can just control the mutations, stabilize its properties, A sudden power fluctuation interrupted their discussion. The greenhouse's lights flickered, and their monitoring equipment momentarily went dark. When power restored, the plant appeared to be glowing more intensely than ever, its crystalline nodes pulsing in a rapid, almost aggressive pattern. "The electric bill came yesterday," Sarah mentioned. "It's tripled since we started the research. People are going to notice, Michael. We can't keep this contained forever." Their decision-making process was further complicated by financial pressures. The equipment they'd borrowed and purchased had strained their already tight budget. The farm's regular operations had begun to suffer as Michael devoted more time to their secret project. Even Sarah's hospital shifts couldn't fully cover their mounting expenses. Late that night, as Michael lay awake in bed, he heard unusual sounds from the greenhouse. The security cameras showed local teenagers gathering nearby, attracted by the strange glow that had become increasingly difficult to hide. He watched as they took photos with their phones, undoubtedly sharing them on social media. Their window of secrecy was closing fast. The next morning brought more challenges. Dave stopped by unexpectedly, commenting on the unusual growth patterns in Michael's tomato field. His questions were casual, but his eyes kept drifting toward the greenhouse. The locals had begun calling Michael's property the Ghost Farm due to the mysterious lights seen at night. "Time's running out," Sarah said after Dave left. "We need to decide. Do we go public on our own terms, or wait until someone forces our hand? And more importantly, do we fully understand what we're dealing with?" As if in response to her questions, the main plant began emanating a new frequency of light, one that sent their monitoring equipment into a frenzy of alarming readings. The choices they'd made were starting to feel less like scientific breakthrough and more like Pandora's box. The crisis began on a quiet Sunday morning, exactly 5 weeks after their initial discovery. Michael woke to the sound of Emma screaming from the greenhouse. He ran across the dew-covered grass in his pajamas, heart pounding, to find his daughter backed against the greenhouse wall, pointing at something that made his blood run cold. The glowing plant, now nearly touching the greenhouse ceiling, had developed what appeared to be pod-like structures along its crystalline trunk. These pods, each about the size of a basketball, were translucent and filled with a swirling, luminescent liquid. But what truly terrified them was the movement visible within. Shadowy shapes that pulsed and shifted in patterns too deliberate to be random. "It started an hour ago," Emma explained, her voice shaking. She'd been conducting her usual morning measurements when the first pod began to form. "They're growing exponentially. I've counted 12 new ones in just the last 20 minutes. Sarah arrived moments later, still in her hospital scrubs from the night shift. Her scientific training kicked in immediately as she began documenting the new development with their video equipment. "The internal temperature of the pods is significantly higher than the rest of the plant," she reported, reading from their thermal scanner. "And there's something else. They're emitting some kind of electromagnetic field." As they watched, one of the pods began to split open. A thick, iridescent liquid dripped onto the soil below, immediately triggering a reaction they couldn't have anticipated. The ground beneath began to crystallize, spreading outward in a rapidly expanding circle. The transformation didn't stop at the greenhouse walls. It continued through the soil, creating a web-like pattern of luminescent veins that stretched toward their main crop fields. "We need to contain this now," Michael ordered, snapping into action. He grabbed their emergency kit, assembled weeks ago for just such a scenario, and began spraying the advancing crystallization with a powerful herbicide. But the chemical seemed to have no effect. If anything, the spread appeared to accelerate in response to the treatment. Emma rushed to her laptop, frantically analyzing readings from the sensors they'd planted throughout the property. "The soil composition is changing at a molecular level," she reported, her voice rising with panic. "It is not just surface contamination, the effect goes at least 6 feet deep, maybe more. And Dad, it's heading toward the aquifer." The implications hit them like a physical blow. If this transformation reached the groundwater supply, there would be no containing it. The entire county's water system could be affected, potentially carrying whatever this was to thousands of homes and farms. Sarah was already on her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed. "James?" "Yes. I know it's Sunday. We have an emergency. Remember those soil samples? We need your help." "No, it can't wait until tomorrow. Bring every piece of containment equipment you have access to. And James, don't tell anyone else. Please, no one else." The next few hours were a blur of desperate activity. They tried everything they could think of to stop the spread. Physical barriers, chemical treatments, even attempting to excavate trenches around the affected area. Nothing worked. The crystalline transformation continued its inexorable advance, now covering nearly a quarter-acre. By afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. The original plant had developed more pods, each one splitting open to release its mysterious liquid. The air in the greenhouse had become thick with an odd, shimmering haze that made it difficult to breathe. Everyone who entered had to wear protective masks, but even these seemed inadequate against whatever was being released. Dr. James Chen arrived just before sunset, his truck loaded with laboratory equipment. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The glowing plant, now more alien than ever, the crystallized soil spreading across the property, and the pod-like structures that continued to multiply. "This is beyond anything I've ever seen," he admitted after they'd explained everything. "You should have contacted me sooner. We need to alert the authorities. EPA, CDC, maybe even military containment units." "Just give us 24 hours, Michael pleaded. "Help us try to contain it first. If we can't—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Once they went public, everything would change, not just for their farm, but for their entire family. As night fell, the situation reached a critical point. The crystalline spread had reached their main crop fields, transforming everything it touched. Regular plants didn't die. Instead, they began to mutate, developing the same luminescent properties as the original specimen. The entire field glowed like something out of a science fiction movie, visible from miles away. Local news vans had begun gathering at the end of their driveway, drawn by calls from concerned neighbors about the strange lights. Police cars arrived shortly after, and Michael could hear the officers radioing for backup as they observed the otherworldly scene from the property line. Inside the greenhouse, Emma had collapsed from exhaustion, her body shaking with fever. Sarah examined her with growing concern. Their daughter's prolonged exposure to the plant appeared to be taking its toll. When she opened her eyes, they noticed something that sent chills through everyone present. Her pupils had developed a faint, but unmistakable luminescent quality. "We're out of time," Sarah announced, her medical training warring with her maternal instinct. "Emma needs hospital care, and we can't hide this anymore. Whatever consequences we face, our daughter's health comes first." Dr. Chen was already making calls, his academic connections potentially their only hope for managing the fallout. But as Michael helped carry Emma to their car, he noticed something that made him freeze in place. The crystalline veins in the soil had begun pulsing in a synchronized pattern, and the pod-like structures on the original plant were all splitting open simultaneously. Something was about to happen, something they couldn't control or contain. The discovery that had seemed like their salvation 5 weeks ago now threatened everything: their farm, their community, possibly even their lives. As emergency vehicles began arriving with flashing lights and blaring sirens, Michael realized they had passed the point of no return. The next 48 hours unfolded like a fever dream. Emma had been admitted to the local hospital's isolation ward, where a team of specialists struggled to understand her condition. Her temperature fluctuated wildly, and the luminescence in her eyes had spread to her skin, creating intricate glowing patterns beneath her epidermis. Sarah hadn't left her daughter's bedside, her medical expertise proving invaluable as the doctors grappled with symptoms they'd never encountered before. Meanwhile, the farm had become ground zero for what the media was calling the Montana light phenomenon. Military vehicles surrounded the property, and teams in hazmat suits moved methodically through the transformed fields, collecting samples and taking readings. The crystalline spread had finally been contained, but only after covering nearly 3 acres of land that now pulsed with an otherworldly glow, visible from satellite imagery. Michael sat in a makeshift command center, formerly his kitchen, surrounded by officials from various government agencies. Dr. Chen had proven to be their salvation, using his academic connections to ensure they were treated as valuable research partners rather than subjects of investigation. His presence had helped legitimize their amateur research efforts and possibly saved them from serious legal consequences. "The genetic modifications we're seeing are unprecedented," announced Dr. Rebecca Torres, a leading botanist who'd flown in from Stanford. She stood before a wall of monitors displaying microscopic images of the transformed plants. These aren't just mutations. It's as if the original plant is rewriting the DNA of everything it touches, creating some kind of interconnected biological network. Like a organic internet, Dr. Chen added, pointing to data streaming across his laptop. The crystalline structures in the soil aren't just spreading the transformation, they're transmitting information. The question is, what kind of information? And to what end? Michael's attention was divided between the scientific discussion and his phone, where he received regular updates from Sarah about Emma's condition. The latest message gave him his first glimmer of hope in days. Emma's fever had finally broken, and the luminescent patterns had stopped spreading. More intriguingly, she had begun drawing complex diagrams and writing equations that the scientists found fascinating. She says she understands it now, Sarah had texted. The plant isn't just growing, it's trying to communicate. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Dave Miller, Michael's neighbor, had arrived with startling news. The same crystalline patterns had been discovered in his fields, but they predated Michael's discovery. He'd dismissed them as mineral deposits until seeing the news reports. Found them about 6 months ago, after that first meteor shower, Dave explained to the assembled scientists. They were just tiny spots back then, barely noticeable, but they've been spreading real slow-like all this time. This revelation sparked intense excitement among the researchers. Teams were immediately dispatched to survey neighboring properties, and satellite imagery was requisitioned to look for similar patterns across the region. What they'd thought was an isolated incident might be part of a much larger phenomenon. Dr. Torres pulled Michael aside as the others rushed to organize the expanded investigation. Your family's exposure to the early stages of this transformation might be crucial to understanding what's happening, she explained, especially your daughter's connection to it. We've never seen anything like this level of human-plant interaction. The mention of Emma brought Michael's fears rushing back. Will she be okay? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. We still don't know what this thing is doing to her. That's what's remarkable, Doctor, Torres replied, showing him some brain scan results on her tablet. The changes we're seeing in her neural patterns don't appear harmful. If anything, they're enhancing her cognitive capabilities. It's as if the plant's communication network has integrated with her nervous system. As if to prove this point, Sarah sent another text. Emma had woken up and was insisting on speaking to the research team. She claimed to have critical information about the plant's purpose, but would only discuss it in person. Against medical advice, arrangements were made to transport her to the farm under careful monitoring. When Emma arrived, supported by Sarah and a medical team, the change in her was striking. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had arranged themselves into complex geometric designs, and her eyes shone with an inner light that matched the pulsing of the transformed fields. But it was her voice that caught everyone off guard. Clear, strong, and filled with unusual certainty. We've been thinking about this all wrong, she announced to the assembled scientists. The plant isn't just a mutation or an invasive species. It's an interface. She walked unsteadily to the greenhouse, where the original plant continued its mysterious transformation. The pods had all opened now, releasing their luminescent contents into the soil, but new structures were forming, crystalline formations that resembled organic computer components. The meteor shower wasn't random, Emma continued. These plants, they're like seeds, but not for reproduction. They're communication nodes, creating a network that can interface with both biological and technological systems. The changes in the soil, in the other plants, in me, it's all part of establishing that network. The scientists listened intently as Emma explained her theory, supported by the complex equations she'd been working on during her fever. According to her, the glowing plant was just the first stage of something much larger. A planetary-scale transformation that could revolutionize not just agriculture, but how humans interacted with the entire biosphere. As Emma spoke, the original plant began responding to her presence, its pulses synchronizing with the patterns on her skin. The other scientists watched in amazement as she appeared to communicate with it non-verbally, the crystalline structures throughout the greenhouse shifting and reorganizing in response to her proximity. "She's right, Doctor," Torres whispered to Michael. "This is beyond anything we imagined. Your daughter isn't just studying this phenomenon. She's become part of it, and through her we might finally understand its true purpose." The transformation of their family farm into an international research station was now complete. 2 months after the initial discovery, dozens of scientists from around the world worked in shifts, studying both the expanding crystalline network and Emma's unprecedented connection to it. The original greenhouse had been encased in a state-of-the-art containment facility, its walls lined with monitoring equipment that tracked every subtle change in the mysterious plant's behavior. Emma, now fully recovered from her fever, had become the key to understanding their discovery. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had stabilized into what the scientists called a biological interface, an intricate network that somehow allowed her to communicate with the crystalline ecosystem spreading throughout their property. "It's like learning a new language," she explained to her parents one morning, as they watched her work with a team of xenobotanists. "But instead of words, it's patterns and frequencies. The plant, the whole network, really. It thinks in systems and connections." Michael observed his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. The 17-year-old who had once dreamed of studying agricultural science was now teaching doctoral researchers about an entirely new form of life. But the changes in her went beyond just knowledge. There was a newfound maturity in her eyes, a depth of understanding that sometimes made her seem more alien than human. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to oversee Emma's medical monitoring. Her background in both biology and healthcare had proved invaluable as they worked to understand the physical aspects of Emma's transformation. "Her brain activity is unlike anything in medical literature," she explained to Michael during one of their private moments. "It's as if she's developed new neural pathways specifically for processing the plant's communications." The breakthrough came on a clear autumn morning, exactly 9 weeks after they'd first discovered the glowing plant. Emma was in the containment facility, working with Dr. Torres on mapping the crystalline network's expansion patterns, when she suddenly went still. The luminescent patterns on her skin began pulsing rapidly, matching a new rhythm emanating from the original plant. "It's ready," she announced, her voice carrying an odd resonance. "It wants to show us something." The plant, now over 15 feet tall and bearing little resemblance to its original form, had developed what appeared to be a central processing node, a crystalline structure at its core that pulsed with complex patterns of light. As the scientists watched in amazement, these patterns began forming three-dimensional holographic projections in the air around it. "It's a manual," Emma explained, walking through the floating images as if reading an invisible book. "Not just for agriculture, for planetary restoration. The network isn't just about growing food. It's about healing damaged ecosystems, rebalancing atmospheric composition, even reversing climate change." Dr. Torres and her team worked frantically to document everything as Emma translated the plant's communications. The holographic displays showed detailed plans for transforming conventional farming practices, using the crystalline network's properties. Crops could be grown with minimal water in any climate, while simultaneously regenerating depleted soil and capturing excess carbon from the atmosphere. "The meteors were sent here deliberately," Emma continued, her voice filled with wonder. "This is terraforming technology, but not for making planets more alien, for restoring them to optimal conditions for native life. Earth isn't the first planet they've helped heal." The implications of her words sent shockwaves through the scientific community. What they'd discovered wasn't just a new species or a biological curiosity. It was a sophisticated tool provided by an advanced civilization, designed to help worlds recover from environmental damage. Michael, watching his daughter interact with this alien technology, felt a profound shift in his perspective. His initial hope of saving their family farm seemed almost quaint now, compared to the possibility of saving their entire planet. Yet the farmer in him couldn't help but appreciate the elegant simplicity of the solution, using enhanced plants to heal the Earth's wounds. The military personnel stationed around the farm had been joined by diplomatic officials as governments worldwide began to grasp the implications of their discovery. The Chinese government had already reported similar crystalline growths emerging in their agricultural regions, and satellite imagery showed patterns developing across every continent. "It's not something that can be controlled or contained," Emma explained to a room full of officials. "The network will grow where it's needed most, helping restore balance to damaged ecosystems. But it needs human cooperation, farmers, scientists, and communities working together to guide its implementation." Sarah had been monitoring Emma's vital signs throughout these revelations, amazed by her daughter's capacity to process and transmit such complex information. "Her brain has actually developed new structures," she reported to the medical team. "It's as if she's evolved to serve as a bridge between human consciousness and the crystalline network's vast intelligence." As evening fell, the family gathered in their old kitchen, now the only private space left in their transformed home. Despite the enormity of their discovery and the chaos of the international response, they found comfort in maintaining this small ritual of family dinner. "Are you scared?" Michael asked Emma, voicing the concern that had been weighing on him since her transformation began. Emma smiled, the patterns under her skin glowing softly in the dimming light. "Not scared," she replied, "but aware of the responsibility. This technology could solve our biggest environmental challenges, but only if we use it wisely. That's why it chose to communicate through humans. We need to be active participants in the healing process." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "The patterns," she said. "They're beautiful now that we understand their purpose, like a map of hope written in light." Outside their window, the crystalline network continued its slow, steady expansion across their fields. The transformed plants glowed with a soft luminescence that now seemed less alien and more like a promise, a sign that humanity's long struggle to balance agriculture with environmental preservation might finally have a solution. The implementation phase began as winter approached, transforming their farm into the world's first test site for what scientists had dubbed Crystalline Agricultural Network Technology, CANT. The original 20 acres had been divided into experimental zones, each dedicated to testing different applications of the alien technology. What had once been a struggling family farm was now humanity's best hope for revolutionizing agriculture. Emma's role had evolved from test subject to chief interpreter, her unique connection to the network making her invaluable to the international research team. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had stabilized into intricate circuits that pulsed with information, allowing her to understand the system's complex requirements and capabilities. "Each zone needs a different approach," she explained during a global conference broadcast from their converted barn. Scientists and agricultural experts from around the world watched as she walked them through the first successful implementations. The network adapts to local conditions, but it requires proper initialization to achieve optimal results. In Zone 1, their original tomato fields had been transformed into a testing ground for enhanced crop production. The crystalline structures in the soil formed precise geometric patterns, creating what Emma called nutrient highways that delivered exactly what each plant needed. The results were staggering. Yields had increased by 300%, while water consumption had dropped by 70%. "The plants aren't just growing better," Dr. Torres announced, presenting their latest findings. "They're actively improving soil quality and sequestering carbon at unprecedented rates. Each enhanced crop serves as a node in the network, contributing to both food production and environmental restoration." Michael had taken charge of Zone 2, where they tested the technology's ability to rehabilitate depleted soil. Years of conventional farming had left parts of their land almost barren, but the crystalline network was rapidly reversing the damage. The soil sparkled with tiny luminescent particles, each one working to restore vital minerals and beneficial microorganisms. "It's like watching the land come back to life," Michael told a group of visiting farmers, his voice thick with emotion. "The network doesn't just feed the plants, it heals the earth itself." He demonstrated how the restored soil now held moisture better, and supported a diverse ecosystem of beneficial insects and microorganisms. Sarah's medical background had proved crucial in Zone 3, where they studied the health implications of crops grown in the enhanced soil. Initial results were promising. The fruits and vegetables showed significantly higher nutrient content and contained trace minerals that improved human health. More surprisingly, they seemed to resist common diseases and pests without any need for chemical interventions. The network creates a natural balance, Sarah explained to a panel of health experts. Plants grown in this system develop stronger immune responses and produce compounds that benefit both human health and soil ecology. Emma spent most of her time in Zone 4, the most experimental area, where she worked with the network to develop entirely new agricultural techniques. The crystalline structures had begun forming three-dimensional growing matrices, allowing crops to grow vertically in intricate patterns that maximized space and sunlight utilization. "It's showing us how to farm in 4 dimensions," she said, gesturing to a towering structure of luminescent plants that twisted in apparently impossible ways. Time becomes a controllable factor in the growing process. We can accelerate or slow growth based on need, while maintaining perfect nutrient balance. The success of their initial implementations had drawn attention from every corner of the globe. Delegations of farmers, scientists, and government officials arrived daily to witness the technology in action. The crystalline network's ability to adapt to different environments and crop types offered hope for addressing food security issues worldwide. Dave Miller, their once skeptical neighbor, had become one of the technology's strongest advocates after seeing the results on his own land. The network had spread naturally to his property, transforming his struggling fields into showcases of sustainable agriculture. "It's like having a master farmer working every inch of your land, 24/7, he told visitors. Only this farmer knows things we're just beginning to understand. As winter set in, the network demonstrated another remarkable capability: temperature regulation. The crystalline structures generated subtle energy fields that protected crops from frost while maintaining optimal growing conditions. For the first time in the farm's history, they were harvesting fresh vegetables in December. "The applications go beyond just farming," Emma explained during a private moment with her parents. "The network is showing us how to create self-sustaining agricultural ecosystems that could work anywhere. Desert regions, urban centers, even off-world colonies eventually." The transformation of their farm had also brought unexpected financial benefits. Companies worldwide were bidding for the right to implement the technology, though Emma insisted that it needed to remain open source and accessible to all. "The network wasn't sent here to make anyone rich," she maintained. "It's here to help us survive and thrive as a species." One evening, as the family walked through their glowing fields, Michael reflected on how far they'd come from that first mysterious discovery. What had started as a desperate hope for saving their farm had evolved into something far more significant: a chance to help heal the world's broken relationship with agriculture. "Do you ever miss how things were before?" he asked Emma, watching the luminescent patterns shift beneath her skin in harmony with the pulsing fields. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember what the network is showing us, that we're all connected, that healing one part helps heal the whole. We're not just farming differently, Dad. We're learning to be better stewards of life itself." 1 year after the discovery of the glowing plant, the Anderson farm had become a symbol of hope for sustainable agriculture worldwide. The crystalline network had spread to cover more than 1,000 acres across multiple farms in the valley, creating an interconnected ecosystem that produced food with unprecedented efficiency while actively restoring the environment. Emma stood at the podium of the United Nations Agricultural Summit, her luminescent patterns glowing softly beneath her professional attire, addressing representatives from every nation. The once shy teenager had grown into a confident speaker, bridging the gap between human understanding and the network's vast knowledge. "What started in our backyard has shown us a path forward," she began, her voice carrying the unique resonance that had become characteristic of her connection to the network. "The crystalline technology isn't just about growing food, it's about restoring balance to our relationship with Earth. Today, I'm pleased to announce that implementation sites have been successfully established on every continent. Screens behind her displayed stunning satellite imagery of crystalline agricultural zones spreading across formerly barren regions. Desert areas in Africa were showing signs of regeneration, while depleted farmland in Asia was being restored to fertility. The network had adapted to each location's unique challenges, proving its versatility and effectiveness. Michael and Sarah sat in the front row, watching their daughter with pride. The past year had transformed not just their farm, but their entire family. Sarah had published groundbreaking research on the health benefits of network-enhanced crops, while Michael had become a leading expert in implementing the new technology, traveling worldwide to help other farmers make the transition. The network has exceeded our initial understanding, Emma continued, as holographic displays showed real-time data from various implementation sites. We've seen crop yields increase by an average of 400% while reducing water consumption by 80%. Soil regeneration rates have surpassed our most optimistic projections, and carbon sequestration levels suggest we could reverse 2 centuries of atmospheric damage within decades. But it wasn't just the environmental statistics that made their discovery revolutionary. The crystalline network had sparked a fundamental shift in how humanity approached agriculture. Farmers were no longer fighting against nature, but working in harmony with it. The technology had made sustainable farming not just possible, but more profitable than conventional methods. Back at the original farm, now an international research center, the transformation was complete. The fields glowed with a soft, ethereal light, producing food year-round regardless of weather conditions. The soil sparkled with crystalline structures that regulated nutrients and moisture while communicating with the global network. Even the air seemed cleaner, freshened by the enhanced photosynthetic processes of the modified plants. Dave Miller, who had once been skeptical, now ran educational programs for visiting farmers. "It's like the land is alive, in a way we never understood before," he would tell them. "The network doesn't just grow crops, it grows understanding." The success had brought wealth to the valley, but not in the traditional sense. Instead of large corporations taking over, the technology had empowered small farmers, creating a new model of cooperative agriculture. The Anderson farm had become the heart of a thriving community of innovative farmers, all connected through the crystalline network. As Emma concluded her UN address, she shared the most important lesson they'd learned. This technology wasn't sent to save us, but to teach us how to save ourselves. It showed us that the answers to our greatest challenges were always here, in the soil, in the subtle connections between all living things, in our capacity to adapt and grow. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Emma or the Anderson family, but for the hope their discovery had given the world. As cameras flashed and delegates applauded, Michael remembered that first morning when he'd discovered the strange, glowing plant in his field. What had seemed like a possible salvation for his struggling farm had become something far more significant, a blueprint for humanity's sustainable future. That evening, the family gathered on their old porch, watching the sun set over their luminescent fields. The crystalline network pulsed with a gentle rhythm, synchronized with the patterns under Emma's skin, a constant reminder of the profound connection between human innovation and natural wisdom. "Do you ever wonder why it chose our farm?" Sarah asked, breaking the peaceful silence. Emma smiled, her eyes reflecting the ethereal light of the fields. "It didn't choose us," she replied. "It chose humanity. We were just the ones who dared to nurture something we didn't understand, to see possibility instead of fear. And now, look at what's growing from that choice." As darkness fell, the farm glowed like a beacon of hope in the valley, its light a testament to the extraordinary journey that had begun with a single mysterious plant. The Andersons had not just saved their farm, they had helped plant the seeds of a global agricultural revolution, one that promised to feed and heal the world for generations to come.